In all of Scripture, Old Testament, New, you can take this principle. The challenge is to reach out to the poor. And to practice justice is the non-negotiable mandate, which means it's not something we pick or choose, okay? Given to every Christian, and it's just as non-negotiable a mandate as to keep the commandments. You know, it's not you can do justice if that's your thing, you know. And this is clear in both Testaments. So let me begin with the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the first time you get this really clearly is with the Jewish prophets, the great prophets, particularly beginning with Isaiah, then the Isaiah tradition, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel. And Jewish scholars said if you take their message on justice and you could coin it into a mantra, and I put the mantra there, and this is the mantra, which is still worth memorizing. So the Jewish prophets say this. They say, the quality of your faith will be judged by the quality of justice in the land. And the quality of justice in the land will always be judged by how widows, orphans, and strangers, and in the Bible that's code. Jesus is going to use that too. Widows, orphans, strangers. Widows, orphans, strangers. That means the three most vulnerable groups in society. How are they doing? Now, don't let this slide by you very easily. Notice that on the judgment day, how are you going to be judged? How often you went to church? Was your sex life in order? This, whatever. They say you're going to be judged by to see the quality of your faith. Did you have real faith? It's going to be judged by the quality of justice in the country you live in. And that's going to be judged by how the three weakest groups, widows, orphans, strangers, how did they fare when you were alive? Now that's a pretty radical shift in religion, because you're going to see later on when we look at the tensions inside of religion, up until the Jewish prophets, that's not the way the Jewish community understood religion. They understood religion as proper practice, synagogue going, keeping the law, and the prophets come along, and, you know, they had all, if you look at like, you know, in the book of Numbers and some of these books, they codify what it meant to be a Jew, and they had like 7,000 laws and so on. And it got right down to how you boil milk, that milk can't be boiled if it touches meat and so on. Well, the prophets came along and they said, God doesn't really care how you boil milk. And God doesn't even care whether you're circumcised. What God cares about is how the poor are doing when you're alive. Okay, that's the essence of the Old Testament teaching. Now, when you get to Jesus, okay, what does Jesus do with that? Jesus not only ratifies it, he deepens it. Jesus doesn't say, well, the Old Testament prophets, they didn't get this right. He said they didn't go far enough. So Jesus deepens it. He said, see, with the Old Testament prophets, that's where we get the first thing we call the preferential option for the poor. The prophet said, God favors the poor. God favors the poor. Jesus comes along and said, God doesn't just favor the poor, God is in the poor. So in Matthew 25, that famous text, which you all know by heart, you know, Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me. You know, and remember, he says, I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. Notice he didn't say, you fed hungry people, you gave food. He said, I was hungry, and you fed me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Now, it's interesting, that text, in Matthew 25, if you just pull that out, later on we're going to put it back into context, and you'll see. But if you just pull this text out and you preach it just as it is, it's probably the most radical text in the entire New Testament, moral text. Because basically, Jesus was answering a question. The question was, how will you be judged at the last day? When you're standing before the judge, what's the criteria? And what's going to be the great test? If you're studying for a test, you want to know the questions. So what's going to be the great test? And Jesus said there's going to be one set of questions. Did you feed the hungry? Give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit prisoners. So what about going to church? What about dogma? What about morality? Just, did you do this? Did you do that? And so on. I always tell students, you know, if you preach that text just as rawly as it is on a Sunday, you'd be in the bishop's office on Monday. You know? So you say, well, how did Jesus get away with it? He didn't. They killed him. He didn't just get into a bishop's office, And this is one of the texts that did him in. Okay. Now, he's going to, when we do the third part, we're going to put that into context. Jesus says some other things that, and you have to put these in tension with that. But Jesus is really clear here. He said, we're going to be judged by how we treat the poor, and how we treat the poor is how we're treating God. Okay. A couple of interesting things about that text. Notice this in the text, that neither the group who did it right or the group who did it wrong knew what they were doing. So the group who did it right said, we didn't know it was you. Jesus said, it doesn't matter. And the group who did it wrong said, had we known. In Matthew's gospel, it's are you doing it right? Not are you doing it for Jesus or doing it for whatever, And then Jesus says, you who did it right, you come with me to my eternal reward. He said, and you who did it wrong, he said, divide into small focus groups. Okay. Okay. No, he said, you depart to Hades. Okay, now, the next part we looked at last week. No. Did I miss a slide? Back up. I missed one. Yeah. I just want to give you those numbers. I gave them to you last week, In the New Testament as such, every 10th line is a challenge to reach out to the poor, in either charity or justice. Not just in justice, but every 10th line. In Luke's gospel, it's every 6th line. In Luke's gospel, every 6th line is a challenge to reach out to the poor, in either charity or justice. And in the letter of James, it's every 5th line. Remember, James has all these strong things, and he's almost cynical sometimes. He said, if you see a poor person, you're on your way to church. Don't say, well, stay warm and well-fed. I'm one off to church. He said, no, you're going to be judged by how you act, and so on. That text James hasn't been very popular in all churches. Some churches have taken James out of their scriptures. Didn't particularly like what he was saying, That's actually not a very good option. If we don't like the text, we'll take that out of scripture and so on. I want to say a little footnote on Luke. It's interesting. Luke is a very nuanced thing on the poor. So on the one hand, Luke is the hardest on the rich, he's the strongest call for the poor. But it's interesting, in Luke's gospel, the rich don't get penalized, and richness are not bad, except in two ways they're bad. They're bad if you're not generous. In Luke's gospel, Jesus praises the generous rich, and he really puts a diatribe against the stingy rich. So in Luke's gospel, if you're rich, it's okay, but you better be generous. And in fact, that's the way his image of God, that God is very, very rich and God is very, very generous. Okay? The second thing with Luke's gospel, riches can be bad if they blind you so you don't see the poor. See that Luke says the danger of riches is that you can get really comfortable, and then if you get really comfortable, sometimes you don't see the Lazarus at your doorstep. See, so he's not, riches aren't wrong, and sometimes in our spiritualities of justice and so on, we're not qualified enough, where we make an ideology out of poverty. Poverty is not good. Poverty is to be eliminated. And in heaven, there's going to be no poor people. In heaven, everybody's going to be rich. So that it's not bad to be rich. It's bad to be rich and not generous. So Luke he's calling to reach out to the poor, but he's not saying if you're rich, you're going to go to hell. He's saying, you will if you're stingy. Okay. You got to be rich, you got to be generous. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit back into the Old Testament again in terms of the law of Moses. And there are some principles. I want to read them to you. And maybe it's going to sound boring in the reading, but it's sometimes until these things are shown to you, we don't really know that they're there. So if you study the Jewish scriptures, and actually, we're no longer supposed to use the word Old Testament. We're supposed to say the Jewish scriptures, okay, because it's not old for them, okay. The first one, The law of Moses assumed that everything we have belongs to God and is not really ours. We are only its stewards and its guardians. We may enjoy it at God's pleasure, but ultimately it's not ours. Now I'll give you one text, Leviticus, but that's really clear from the creation at the beginning. If you notice, when the man and woman are created in Genesis, God doesn't say you own the planet. God says you're its stewards. You're its guardians. You're the gardener. See, the gardener doesn't own the garden. They take care of the garden, and they get to get the produce. But it's not their garden, okay? The steward is in charge of the master's property, but it's not his property. It's the master's property, you know? See, and that's the way we're supposed to understand all ownership on this planet, you know? We're stewarding everything you have, your house, your bank account, everything, not just physical, but even the talents God gave you, your physical looks, your brains, everything, they're not yours. They're a richness that God gave you, and you're the gardener, you're the steward. In fact, today when we have much more concern and sensitivity about ecology and taking care of the earth, the image of gardener is a good image. See, a gardener doesn't apologize for eating vegetables, but the gardener takes care of the garden. He doesn't rape the garden or, ravage it or whatever. Garden, you take care of the garden. It's going to be there next year and so on. You stored it. Okay. See, so we need to understand, it's very important that in terms of ownership, when we get to Catholic social principles and so on, we don't own. We store it. It's not ours. When I was in novitiate, Oblate novitiate, and our novice master, French-Canadian, great guy. And we were all these 17, 18-year-old farm kids from Western Canada and so on. And as Oblates, we're supposed to take the vow of poverty, And so he made us write in the front of everything, and even on our hockey sticks and so on. We had to write with a felt pen in Latin, ad usum. In Latin, that means it's for your use. See, your toothbrush, it's for your use. It's not yours. And actually, if those of you are religious, that's what the vow of poverty means. It doesn't mean you don't have a television set or whatever it means, but you don't ever have the illusion that this is yours. You get to use it, but it's not yours. And we made a big joke about that and so on. Well, one of my classmates, who was with us for 7 years, didn't make his final vows, and he left and he married. He became a medical doctor. And one day I was in his office, and I was looking around, poking through some of his library books, and they have these big medical texts that cost $300. And in front of every one of these texts he had written, ad usum. And so I said to him, Gary, he said, no. He said, I took that seriously from my novitiate as an oblate. He said, this isn't mine. I get to use it. He said, I've kept that. I said, it's not really mine. Ad usum. Some years ago when I was teaching summer at the University of Seattle, there was a young Benedictine monk in class. And he shared a story on this. And he says, I joined the monastery at 18. He said, and now I'm 38. He said, I've been here 20 years. And he said, for most of those 20 years, he said, I resent it. He said, we have a very strict abbot. He said, so he makes us do all the pro forma of the vow of obedience. He said, so we have to ask permission for everything. He said, if I want to get a pencil or a pen out of the supply office, I got to ask the superior, can I have a pen? If I want to buy a new shirt, I have to ask the superior, can I buy this shirt? He says, yes. He said, and I always thought that's so infantile. I'm 35 years old. I could be the president of a company, and I'm asking to buy a shirt. Can I have a pen? He said, until one day I realized, he said, everybody should be doing that. He said, if the presidents of our country had to ask permission for a shirt, we'd have a very different world. See, we tend to live under the illusion that this is ours. I earned it, it's my money, and so on. You see, no, you get to use it. You get to use it. Ad usum, And, but that's the first fundamental principle in the Jewish scriptures. Then, they tease that out. They say that in every 7th year, all the slaves were set free, and each was to take with him or her enough of the master's property to be able to live an independent life. It's interesting, when you read scripture scholars on St. Paul, that so many of these people were actually slaves who were freed. Barnabas and so on. They did their time. And after 7 years, you have to set your slave free, okay? And not only that, you have to give this person enough to start a life on, like a father sending a mother sending a child into the world, okay? Then also, every 7th year, all economic debts were canceled. And incidentally, that's still in our laws. When we say the statute of limitations, 7 years. That's from the Jewish law. After 7 years, no matter what the person owed you, it's finished. It's finished. You write off the debt, and so on. Okay. Then, every 7th year, one's land was to lie fallow and to enjoy its own Sabbath. So the whole idea is you're supposed to have a sabbatical every 7 years, but so are all your fields. So Sabbath also applied to the land. So every 7th year, you weren't allowed to seed, okay? And during that year, the owner didn't sow anything and the owner didn't reap anything. And the poor could go on these fields and pick whatever there was. Every 7th year, the produce belonged to the poor. Okay, then, a couple more principles. At all times, landowners were forbidden to reap and harvest the corners of their fields. So suppose you had a 40-acre field. The corners, you weren't allowed to reap them, and the poor were to reap whatever, with the intent that the poor reap those edges. See, so you're leaving the corners, which they figured was kind of a tenth of your thing. See, that's the way you did tithing, so that it was prescribed. You give 1/10 of your goods to the poor, and they could come and actually take it, okay? And then lastly, finally, more radically, every 50th year, all the lands would be restored to the original tribe or household that first owned them. So ownership, if you bought a property, you only got to keep it for 50 years. Again, see, you didn't own it. You were stewarding it. And then, most important, doing this wasn't considered a virtue. It wasn't like, I obey the law, I give to the poor. This was legal. This was a law. This was an obligation. You didn't say, well, I'm a really good person because I let the poor take the ends of my fields and so on. No, this is what it meant to be a religious person.